And our next presenters will be Greg Hankins and later Job Snijders on security and resiliency for peering at IXPs and in practice. Since Joe brushed off.
Hey, good afternoon. I'll kind of set the stage on our joint presentation. The slides that I'm going to show are an abbreviation of a presentation that I gave at GPF earlier this year and EPF last year on specifically peering observations at an IXP. So I'll kind of set the stage about what I was looking at and what I wanted to see, and then Joe will come back and tell you his perspective as seen from NTT's global network. So I'll just talk a little bit about the introduction, and then some of the resource questions that I wanted to answer, and then a little bit about the configuration results that I saw. First, I want to thank DKIX and Console Networks, used to be IIX, for supporting this project. They gave me free power, free space, free interconnection at DKIX New York, so I appreciate that and appreciate their support. Here's my perspective on peering, and here's kind of what drove me to ask these questions. I used to manage BGP at Mindspring with Brandon Ross. Hey, Brandon. Way back in the late 90s. And I went and worked for a bunch of router vendors, and I did a peering project in 2007 at PAX, and then I said, well, there's been all this stuff that's changed in the industry, so I wanted to look at what has changed since 2007 versus 2016, and just kind of see how people are deploying BGP from an operational perspective. I didn't want to focus on route analysis or AS path analysis or things like that. There's a bunch of good projects out there. Jeff Houston does a lot of research on that. There's the Oregon Route Views project and a whole bunch of others. So that wasn't really what I wanted to look at. I wanted to look at really the nuts and bolts of the configurations of how people actually configure features. And the driving question was, we get a lot of feature requests. We get so many feature requests that we can't implement, and we get a lot of feature requests that we then implement that people don't actually use. So BGP RPKI is maybe a good example where a lot of vendors and the RIRs have put considerable effort in developing all these tools, and then adoption hasn't been as high as we expected. So I really wanted to look at what are the implications of doing all these things. There's a ton of RFCs and internet drafts that are coming out of the IETF that, are people actually using this stuff? So my idea was, I'm just going to deploy a router at an exchange and then passively peer. So I didn't go out and ask people, will you peer with me? I just accepted peering requests as they came in, and I got about 70 peers or so over the past several months. So what can you observe just from looking at peering? You can look at control plane packets. You can look at what protocols people are using. You can look at the BGP capabilities that they're sending you. You can look at the routes, and you can look at the path attributes. Some things that you can't see, and I'm really not interested in that, so it doesn't matter. I can't see people's router configuration. I can't see their routing or peering policies. I can't see their network architecture. I just can't see any of their proprietary policies or agreements that they have, so I'm not interested in those things anyway, as I mentioned. So here's some configuration results that I correlated between a peering research project at PAX Palo Alto in 2007, and then 2016 at DKIX Frankfurt in New York. The unique BGP peers, I'll just point out, that's the number of unique ASNs that I'm peering with. So you can see it's stayed roughly the same, about the same. A couple interesting things that I'll point out here is that even though the unique BGP peers have stayed about the same, the number of sessions has increased at least 2.5 times or so. So that is because everyone is doing IPv6 now. A lot of people have multiple connections. So, for example, large companies have multiple connections to an IXP now, and they're peering on multiple routers there, and they want peering sessions on all those routers. And then there's also peering with route servers, which counts as a BGP session. In terms of other notable things, there's almost 100% v6 peering now. So back in 2007, only 6 out of 21 peers, and 2016, 37 out of 39, so that's pretty good. There's absolutely no interdomain multicast interest even back then versus now. No one's interested in doing BFD, and the thing that I mentioned is that route server peers are now very common at IXPs. So back in 2007, IXPs had just started to roll out route servers, but I think now everyone would probably say that a route server is part of your standard IXP features that you would accept. You look at the security features in use. Again, just looking at the number of unique peers, MD5 seemed to be more popular back in 2007, rarely used now. Why is that? We'll come back to that. GTSM was not supported back in 2007 on, I don't think on any equipment. I forgot when the RFC came out. Now, no one is asked to do GTSM with me. And then TCP authentication option, not available in 2016, maybe still too early. I'm sorry, not available in 2007, maybe still too early in 2016, but no interest in that either. So if we just look at a couple of the security options real quick, I'll just give you the basics. MD5 defines an MD5 digest that is carried in a TCP segment. It's used to authenticate the segment. Mostly back then, people were worried about TCP respets, so maybe that's not such a big issue these days with implementations that are more advanced. People generally dislike MD5 because it tends to cause more operational problems than it solves. There's password negotiation, there's password management, you have to store the passwords. A lot of people store them maybe in the router configuration as plain text and a description, so that maybe is not the best idea either. And then there's, like I said, there's a notable decrease in use. Only 4 unique peers that are appearing with me requested MD5. Now, if we correlate that with the peering survey results from 2008, you can also see that it's drastically different than it was in 2008. 2008, a number of people insisted or said that they will use it. A number of people even recommended it. So I think that's a notable change that we've seen in the past several years versus 2016. The other thing I want to mention is about GTSM. So this is basically securing BGP connections between routers on the same segment. So peering between routers, unless you're using multi-hop, is usually on the same LAN segment. I would say it's probably always on the same LAN segment at an IXP. So you know that the TTL cannot be anything other than 255. That means it came off a different layer 3 network. So the idea is that you compare the TTL or the hop count in the BGP packets that you get and make sure that they're always 255. It requires some manual negotiation and configuration, and actually vendor implementations are slightly different syntax and slightly different logic, so you have to kind of be careful when you're configuring that. In terms of the TTL, I saw most peers were sending a TTL of 1, some were sending 64 for some reason, I'm not sure why that is. Now, if we compare that back to the peering survey from 2008, it's really not changed. Back in 2008, a lot of people didn't have support for it on their routers. I think that's maybe changed now, but most people didn't know what it was, had no plans to support it, or just weren't going to deploy it for some reason. So if you look at the BGP capabilities in use, this I looked at just with show commands from the router, and again, just having the unique BGP peers. Everyone is sending multi-protocol extensions. That means that the router can route multiple protocols, probably v6. Most people sent one address family over the BGP peering session. A couple were sending 2, and then one was actually sending multicast before. It's probably a misconfiguration. The implication to that is that network operators prefer to keep their control plane signaling and the data plane signaling on the same protocol. So that means people receive IPv4 routing information over a v4 transport and v6 routing information over a v6 transport. No one is sending v6 routes over v4. So I think that means that people want to keep it separate so that it fails separately. Everyone is sending route refresh. That's interesting, but as far as I know, it's enabled on every implementation, so I'm not really sure if people are using it. Some vendors have counters to see how many route refresh requests have been received, so I don't know. Back in 2007, there was a historical capability that is not seen anymore, so I guess that's good. No one is sending the enhanced route refresh. No one is using ORF. No one is using graceful restart. This is really interesting. And then everyone, except for one peer, actually supports a 32-bit AS number now. There is actually one peer that I'm peering with that does not support a 32-bit AS number. I thought was interesting. And then no one is using add paths. So I think it's a combination of maybe some of these don't make sense at IXPs, maybe some of these make sense more for your IGP or your internal peering. Maybe it's just too early for some of these features in terms of vendor support. So to summarize this up, these are the observations. I broke it into security and resiliency. So given for security that IXP networks are often leaked into the global routing table, so you can't count on your router being secure just because you're peering at an IXP. MD5 is rarely used now. No one's doing TCP AO, no one's doing GTSM. What are the conclusions on that? Maybe now network security has just evolved some and we're not worried about the TCP security issues that we were worried about in the late 90s or early 2000s when all these vulnerabilities came out with guessing sequence numbers and things like that. Maybe it's just too complicated. Maybe the trade-off and complexity of security features isn't worth the benefit. Maybe people just trust people at an IXP. I wouldn't, but maybe people think you're peering at an IXP, so you must be clueful somehow. Or maybe people use policy filtering or some sort of external database like Job was just talking about to do some validation. I don't know. But there doesn't seem to be any interest in BGP session level security. From a resiliency standpoint, no one's using BFD, given that IXPs often have, unless you're peering at a very small IXP where your port is actually directly connected to a switch, and the other members also connect to the same switch, there's often networks in between. So an interface could fail and be half open, meaning that your interface could be up, but your peer's interface is down because you're connected to different infrastructure. In that case, you have to rely on the control plane aliveness detection, which for BGP, if you're using default timers, is 90 seconds. So that means you're black holing traffic for a very long time if you're not using some sort of faster detection mechanism. So I'm still kind of confused about why people wouldn't want to use BFD over an internet exchange. No one's using BGP graceful restart. No one's using add path. And as I mentioned, route refresh is enabled by default, but I just have a feeling it's not really used a whole lot. So again, the same conclusions. As for security, do people not care? Maybe they just route around IXPs. Maybe they use an internal routing mechanism where they just reroute around failures. I don't know, maybe it's too complicated. Maybe people consider IXP connections as a different quality and they don't care if it fails. I don't think that's the case. Or maybe they just think that IXPs are so stable that they never fail. So I don't know, those could be some possible conclusions. So in summary, it just kind of seems like there's little interest in protocol and resiliency configuration at IXPs. So when I gave this presentation at GPF and at EPF, a number of operators stood up and they said, for MD5 specifically, it makes automation very complicated. People were at the microphone begging their peers not to use MD5 because of the manual negotiation involved. And they also said that kind of the KISS principle makes a lot of sense and it was just too much added complexity to configure authentication or BFD or something like that at an IXP. So with that, here's a bunch of references that you can look at in your spare time. So with that, we'll turn it over to Job, and he'll talk to you about his perspectives from NTT.
When Greg did this research, he approached me and said, what is your take on BGP capabilities as seen from your vantage point? And that's how we ended up with looking at it from a real network, not a small research network. My colleague Saku Uti and Troy Boudreau were instrumental in collecting data from every eBGP session that we have on this planet. And we parsed that data for certain interesting characteristics that I want to share with you. About 44% of our eBGP sessions is IPv6. And I'm pleasantly surprised to see that there is an almost 1-to-1 ratio between v4 and v6. However, if you zoom in and use a Venn diagram, we see that the overlap is not entirely complete. We have some v6 only peers and we have a whole bunch of v4 only peers. So this reminds me of the picture I took at the RIPE meeting in Copenhagen, where there was a single booth with 2 instruments that led to the same sewage system. If we look at capabilities, route refresh is supported by every eBGP neighbor that NTT has. So 100% is quite an impressive number, and it is very useful, especially when we deploy our filters in the middle of the night and then ask the peer to send us a refreshed version of their routes. However, on the other hand, enhanced route refresh we see nowhere in our network, and this is because we don't have equipment that supports it, and nor do our customers have equipment that supports it. And this is a shame because enhanced route refresh is an awesome method to get rid of still routing entries without flapping the BGP session. This is another strange metric that I cannot really explain. Graceful restart capability, 43% of our V4 sessions supported, but only 31% of the V6 sessions. And I would expect that number to be the opposite, because in general, the V6 equipment, I imagine it lands on more modern hardware because it's more novel technology. I really don't know why this is. Maybe people land the V6 sessions on different hardware than the V4 sessions. I could do a comparative analysis by checking MAC addresses, but that is for further study. Another good capability, about 85% of our eBGP neighbors support 4-byte ASNs, and I hope that that number continues to rise and soon reaches 100%. Here we see the opposite, that there's a little bit more in V6 than V4, and this strengthens my hypothesis that people do land the V6 sessions on slightly more modern hardware. On about 62% of our BGP sessions, we have MD5 enabled. It is our policy that by default we'll negotiate a password with the peer to protect the session. And this helps protect against various types of attacks. Some will argue that MD5 deployment and management is very hard, but other people just put all the passwords in a database and are done with it. Multicast is another beautiful feature of this interdomain routing ecosystem. On about 5.7% of our sessions, we see that both parties support multicast. However, within the multicast DFC, that's about 2,500 routes at this moment, only 3.6 of them, that's about 89 routes, are our customer routes. And if you compare that to the normal unicast customer cone, that's 0.04%. So I think we can all agree that multicast is no longer considered very useful in the interdomain routing. Then other features that we don't see, we don't do BFD. We prefer that people just directly plug in their router into our router, and if the link goes down, then both parties will see that. Alternatively, you can set the BGP timer to something low. But other than that, BFD deployment has led to some operational challenges, and we have not yet found perfectly bug-free software to do it. ORF and AdPath are also features that we don't use. With ORF, I think it's unfair to place the burden on the far peer. You should do that type of filtering yourself. And AdPath for just an IP transit provider makes no sense in my opinion, so that's why we don't see it. So regardless of what your capabilities are, we all share this earth. This concludes the statistics from our side. Is there time for questions, or you wanna?
Or would you like to share your own observations?
This is Andy from WISNet. Your last presentation and this one together brought a question to mind. You brought up, you have a number of folks that do not support 4-byte ASN. I took a quick look on my routing table and I see a number of folks that are originating routes from the transitional 23456 ASN. With your new bogon list of ASNs, are you going to be restricting folks that currently don't have capabilities in their routers to advertise those prefixes without originating from 23456?
That's not how the technology works, so there's limited risk. I think Jared seems to be jumping up and down and wants to say something.
Yeah, sorry to jump the line. Jared Moss from NTT. So the way the 4x AS stuff works is that you have the AS path and you have the AS4 path. If your device is AS4 capable, which all of ours are, that is the one that you actually look at. And the other ones come in as, they just get passed transparently through the network as you pass them through. So as long as your devices are 4x AS capable, you will see the actual 4x AS as opposed to seeing the 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the AS transitive. So only people who are on devices who are not 4-byte capable are the ones who should not deploy a filter against 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Everyone else will see the actual AS number.
But if my AS is a 4-byte and my device is not capable of doing 4-byte,
Then
how
you
do I
should go back
originate
to
my
your
prefix?
RAR and
Yeah,
request a
then you
2-byte ASN. In the interest of time, let's stop the question queue.
And please, brief questions. We'll do the center microphone. We do have lightning talk submissions open.
Matt Petak, Yahoo, very quickly. You said no to BFD because it's got operational headaches, but you tell people to do MD5. How do you juxtapose those two?
I have no good answer.
Okay. Eric Muller, you mentioned most people not using BFD and relying on timers. Did you take any look at what sort of timers people were requesting?
From the top of my head, most people run with the absolute default. So with Junos, it's 90. With Cisco, it's 180 or something. And it's rarely that people tune them to something lower. But it does happen. And according to the specifications, you cannot stop the peer from setting a lower timer. So. All right, I'll be at NTT's booth here during the break, so if you have any further questions or want to argue, come visit us.
All right, thank you. So very quickly, we have a survey gift winner. You must be present to win. It is an iPad Pro 9.7, and I'm looking for Chris Spears. Are you here? All right, come on up. We're now going to break. We'll be back at 4:30 for the next session. Thank you.